I never imagined that the day my mother-in-law, Betty Brown, moved into our home would mark the beginning of a 2-year nightmare. I remember that spring morning so vividly, as she stood there with her suitcase, wearing a modest smile and carrying a heartbreaking story about her financial troubles on the verge of bankruptcy. With a trembling voice, she told me she felt terrible asking, but she had nowhere else to go. Her eyes, so similar to Shane's, were brimming with tears as she explained how her import business had collapsed during the economic crisis. As a successful entrepreneur myself, I felt genuine empathy for her situation. Having built my own technology company from nothing, I understood how devastating financial setbacks could be. After all, I thought, isn't family supposed to help each other in times of need? I assured Betty, who showed relief in her expression for the first time in 3 years, that she shouldn't worry. She hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear that I was an angel. That night, while Betty was settling into the guest room, Shane and I discussed the financial situation in our bedroom. I suggested that we should help support his mother with a monthly allowance for basic expenses until she got back on her feet. Shane nodded, though he seemed uncomfortable talking about money. When he asked how much I was thinking, avoiding my eyes, I quickly calculated in my head. I proposed $600 monthly, explaining it would cover basic expenses and allow for some savings. Shane's eyes widened as he expressed surprise at my generosity, with something else in his expression I couldn't identify at the time, perhaps relief. I explained that his mother needed to recover, and my current income could easily handle it. When I asked if it would be temporary, Shane quickly nodded, assuring me it would only be until his mother got back on her feet financially. The next day, we told Betty our decision. Her reaction was strange. I thought I saw a flash of triumph in her eyes, but it disappeared so quickly that I convinced myself I had imagined it. She hugged us both, exclaiming she didn't know how to thank us, promising to work hard to move forward and not be a burden. The first few months went smoothly. Betty quickly adapted to our home, cooking delicious meals, actively helping with housework, and always sharing kind words and pleasant stories during family dinners. However, as time passed, I began noticing small changes. Betty's shopping for necessities gradually became more luxurious. One day, she came home with a fur coat she claimed to have found on sale. When I gently pointed out that our climate wasn't cold enough for such a coat, she dismissed my concern with a laugh, asking if I didn't think it suited her and suggesting she might need a good coat someday. Though I didn't pursue the matter further, I felt growing anxiety inside. 6 months had passed since she arrived, and I had hoped to see some progress in her financial situation. One afternoon, while drinking coffee on the terrace, I casually asked about her job search, particularly anything that might utilize her import sales experience. Her expression clouded momentarily before she quickly forced a smile. She sighed, telling me the market was very tough, and who would hire someone her age? She thought focusing on taking care of us was the best way to repay our generosity right now. Her response made me uneasy, but I didn't push further. After all, financial recovery takes time. As months passed, however, the situation began weighing heavily on both our finances and our relationship. The monthly allowance of $600, which had initially seemed reasonable, had become a constant drain on our assets. A year after she moved in, I tried to discuss the situation with Shane again. One night, while getting ready for bed, I suggested we should talk to his mother about finding a job, as I hadn't seen any effort to improve her situation in the past year. Shane visibly tensed up. He defended his mother, saying she was doing her best by taking care of us, and reminding me that it was hard for someone her age to find employment. When I tried to respond, he cut me off. In a tone that brooked no argument, he stated that she was his mother and they couldn't throw her out on the street. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. I wondered how we had gotten into this situation, when our generosity had turned into obligation, and why I seemed to be the only one troubled by it all. As Betty's stay entered its second year, tensions in the house became more apparent. Expenses kept mounting, and my attempts to suggest budgets or shopping limits were met with hurt looks and veiled accusations of being stingy. One day, Betty approached me, with tears in her eyes, asking if I thought she enjoyed depending on us, saying she would change the situation immediately if she could. I immediately felt guilty. When I tried to explain myself, she cut me off, wiping her tears with a silk handkerchief, another gift to herself with our money. She promised to double her efforts to find a solution. But no solution seemed to materialize. Instead, the expenses kept increasing. One day it was new jewelry, the next day a membership to an exclusive club in town, and whenever I questioned these expenses, she gave the same answer about investing in her future and maintaining appearances, while rebuilding her network. Meanwhile, my own company was beginning to feel the strain. The monthly $600 that had initially seemed manageable now represented a significant portion of my income. I had to postpone expansion plans and turn down promising investment opportunities simply due to lack of funds. One night, reviewing the books, I realized we had spent a considerable sum on Betty's allowance over the past 2 years. I decided it was time for a serious conversation with Shane. I found him in his study, reviewing work documents. Taking a deep breath before starting, I tried to keep my tone neutral as I told him we needed to discuss his mother's situation. He looked up from his papers, frowning. When I pointed out that 2 years had passed and we were depleting our resources supporting her while seeing no effort on her part to change the situation, Shane stood up, his face flushing red. He demanded to know if I was calling his mother a freeloader. I tried to explain that wasn't what I meant, though deep down, I had begun to think exactly that. I told him we simply couldn't keep supporting her indefinitely. I suggested we needed to set a deadline and get some concrete plans for his mother's independence. Shane repeated the words deadline and a plan incredulously, asking if I was treating his mother like some business project, insisting you couldn't put deadlines on family. His words hurt me deeply. I demanded to know about our future as a couple, reminding him about the children we had planned for, the travels we had dreamed of, and the business expansion we had put on hold, all because of his mother. With a sarcastic tone I had never heard before, Shane sneered that it was all about money, suggesting that I, the big businesswoman, couldn't stand to see my profits decrease. His accusation stunned me into momentary silence, the words cutting deep. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about money, but about responsibility, limits, and our increasing difficulty in building our own future. But it was like talking to a wall. Shane refused to see the situation from my perspective. The argument continued for hours, our voices rising and falling, but we reached no resolution. That night, lying sleepless in bed, I realized I was trapped in an impossible situation. On one side was my love for Shane and desire to keep our home peaceful. On the other was my growing resentment toward a situation that was draining not just our financial resources, but the very foundation of our relationship. As I listened to Shane breathing quietly beside me, I knew something had to change before things broke beyond repair. Little did I know then that the coming events would test not just my patience and generosity, but my very safety and well-being. That March night will forever be etched in my memory. The air felt heavy with tension that had been building for months, like a storm about to break. I was in my home office reviewing the latest financial reports for my company. As the clock approached 10:30, I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Before I could react, the door burst open and Betty appeared, her face flushed red, with a gleam in her eyes I had never seen before. In a voice that tried but failed to hide its demanding tone beneath sweetness, she told me she needed to talk urgently. I put down my papers and tried to maintain my composure as I looked at her. When I asked what was wrong, noting the late hour, she entered my office and closed the door. She excitedly announced that an incredible opportunity had arrived, an investment that could change everything. I had heard this kind of talk before, but something in her tone this time felt different. Trying to keep my voice neutral, I asked what kind of investment it was. She explained that a friend, supposedly a famous businessman, had offered her a chance to participate in a luxury import business. She insisted it was the opportunity of a lifetime, but she needed an additional $5,000 to secure her position. I felt months of suppressed frustration rising inside me. I reminded her that we had already discussed this, and the monthly $600 we were giving her should be enough for her expenses and any investments she wanted to make. Her expression changed in an instant. The mask of kindness fell away, revealing a look of anger that chilled my blood. She screamed, asking how I could say it was enough, demanding to know if I understood what it took to maintain appearances in this world and what she needed to rebuild her life. I stood up, feeling the need to be at eye level for this confrontation. I told her that far from being enough, we had been more than generous. I tried to point out that after 2 years, her efforts to recover, but I couldn't finish my sentence. Betty suddenly lunged for the baseball bat, hanging on the wall, a souvenir from our trip. With unexpected agility, she ripped it from the wall. As she brandished the bat, she roared about my supposed generosity, asking if I would deny her even the basics while I lived in luxury. I wanted to dodge, but my body froze in shock. The bat struck my back with tremendous force, making me cry out in pain and shock. More from surprise than impact, I fell to the floor. Betty continued, raising the bat again, calling me ungrateful and demanding to know how I could treat her this way after all she had done for us. I rolled on the floor trying to avoid a second strike, my thoughts spinning wildly. I couldn't comprehend how this woman, who had claimed to love me like a daughter, could attack me like this. Raising my hands defensively, I begged Betty to stop, insisting we could talk about this without violence. But she wouldn't listen. Betty had completely lost control, years of resentment and frustration surfacing in an uncontrollable explosion of rage. She spat out that she was sick of talking, sick of having to beg for what should rightfully be hers. That's when I saw him. Shane was standing in the doorway of the office, watching the scene with an indescribable expression. My husband, who had sworn to love and protect me, stood there without moving a finger while his mother attacked me. My voice trembling with pain and disbelief, I whispered Shane's name, begging for help. But he didn't move. His eyes, so similar to his mother's, watched me with a mixture of pity and contempt. In that moment, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just the physical pain of the blow, but a deeper wound, an unforgivable betrayal. Betty seemed to regain some composure at the sight of her son. Though she lowered the bat, her eyes still burned with hatred. In a voice that tried but failed to sound sweet, grating like nails on a chalkboard, she called to her dear Shane, complaining that his wife was refusing to help despite all her devotion. She claimed I was treating her like a beggar. Shane stepped forward, but toward his mother, not me, placing his hand on her shoulder. He gently told her to calm down, suggesting that I surely didn't mean to upset her. I couldn't take it anymore. Summoning strength I didn't know I had, I stood up. The pain in my back was intense, but the pain in my heart was even greater. With a voice shaking with anger and disappointment, I asked if that was all he had to say, if he was really going to comfort her after she had just attacked me. Shane looked ashamed, but his next words completely shattered any hope I might have had left. Shane tried to tell me it was all a misunderstanding, that his mother was going through a difficult time. I cut him off incredulously, asking how he could possibly justify her hitting me with a baseball bat. Betty, clearly emboldened by her son's attitude, straightened her posture. She dismissed my reaction as dramatic, claiming she had barely touched me and that I had always been prone to exaggeration. In that moment, looking at the faces of these two people who were supposed to be my family, I finally acknowledged the truth I had been denying for so long. I was completely alone, surrounded by people who saw me, not as a human being but as a means to an end in what had become my prison. With a calmness I didn't feel, I told them both to get out immediately. Shane took a step toward me, wearing what I now recognized as a fake mask of concern. He pleaded with me not to talk like that, suggesting we could discuss everything calmly tomorrow. In an ice-cold voice, I repeated my demand for them to leave. I told Betty to forget about the $5,000, and that her monthly allowance was finished. Betty's face contorted with anger. She exclaimed in outrage, insisting she was family and that this wasn't how family should be treated. Fighting back tears I refused to let them see, I responded that real family wouldn't treat each other this way. I warned them to leave immediately, or I would call the police. Shane took his mother's arm and guided her toward the door. Before leaving, he turned to me, one last time. He begged me to think carefully and not make any hasty decisions. I didn't feel his words deserved a response. As soon as the door closed, I collapsed into my chair. The pain in my back had become a constant reminder of the betrayal I had just experienced. As I listened to their voices, growing fainter in the hallway, my mind began racing. I knew this wasn't over. I understood Betty and Shane all too well now. They would try to manipulate me, make me feel guilty, convince me it had all been a misunderstanding. But something had changed within me. For the first time in 2 years, I saw my situation with complete clarity, as if a blindfold had been lifted from my eyes. This wasn't a home, it was a prison cell, and I, who had always prided myself on my independence and strength, had become a willing prisoner. I looked around my office, my eyes lingering on each item that represented my hard work, my dreams, and my aspirations. I wondered how much I had sacrificed to maintain this illusion of family. The answer was crystal clear: I couldn't waste another dollar or another second. With trembling hands, I opened my laptop and began doing what I do best, making plans. I checked bank accounts, investments, and contacts, discovering assets that Betty and Shane knew nothing about. These were precautionary measures I had taken, sensing they might be needed someday. From another room, I could occasionally hear Betty and Shane's whispers. As I continued working, I felt an odd sense of calm envelop me. The initial fear and confusion had given way to cold, calculated determination. I was no longer a victim in this story. I had taken control. As I strategized, time flew by quickly. When I looked up from my computer, I could see the sky beginning to brighten. A new day was dawning, and with it, a new Brittany. Ignoring the pain in my back, I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror hanging on the office wall. The woman who looked back at me had tired eyes but was filled with determination. I knew exactly what I needed to do. With quiet steps, I left the office and headed to the master bedroom. Shane was sleeping deeply, making soft breathing sounds. I stood watching him for a while, remembering the man I had fallen in love with and wondering when he had transformed into this stranger sleeping before me. Pushing these thoughts aside, I began moving with purpose. I gathered important documents, jewelry, and everything else I might need. I was amazed at my own calmness as I did all this. As I packed, the events of the previous night kept replaying in my mind. Betty's violence, Shane's passivity, and my situation, now crystal clear to me. Each memory strengthened my resolve. The only way out of this situation was to leave as quietly as they had built this golden cage around me. After finishing packing the essentials, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Shane one last time. How had it come to this? With a sigh, I stood up and left the room. The house was quiet except for Betty's occasional snoring from the guest room. As I walked down the hallway, each step took me further from the life I had known and closer to an uncertain but independent future. When I reached the front door, I paused for a moment and looked back at the house that had been both my home and my prison. A lonely tear rolled down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away. This was not the time for tears, but for action. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped into the crisp morning air. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. As I walked toward my car, which I had strategically parked the night before, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. The pain in my back was still there, a constant reminder of what I was leaving behind. But with each step, I felt lighter and stronger. I knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. As I drove toward an uncertain destination, a smile formed on my lips. The old Brittany had died last night, killed by a baseball bat, and the betrayal of those who claimed to love me. But from those ashes, a new Brittany was emerging, stronger, wiser, and above all, free. I settled into a small apartment in the suburbs, far enough from my previous home to feel safe and large enough to lose myself in. Every morning as I woke up to this new reality, I felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. I vividly remembered the moment I saw Shane standing in the doorway. Those eyes that had once looked at me with such love were now empty and distant. There was no shock, no anger, not even concern. There was only quiet acceptance of what was happening. Sitting on the small balcony of my temporary home, I whispered Shane's name, wondering aloud when he had become such a different person. The memories of our marriage, once warm and comforting, now seemed tainted with ominous shadows. Looking back over the past few years was like watching myself, trying to force together puzzle pieces that never truly fit. I remembered when Shane first talked about his mother's financial problems. It was during a romantic dinner, just months after our wedding. Shane had taken my hand across the table and told me he was worried about his mother, explaining that her business wasn't doing well. My heart had filled with sympathy at that moment. I had asked if there was anything we could do to help. His face had brightened in what I now recognized as a calculated way. He had suggested we could lend her some money until she got back on her feet. And that was how it began. Small loans and assistance gradually turned me into a convenient resource for a family that saw me as a means rather than a member. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. Betty always seemed to need more than what was given. Shane consistently took his mother's side in arguments, and my concerns were skillfully dismissed. Whenever I tried to discuss his mother's excessive spending, Shane would tell me that I was good with numbers, but worried too much, always reminding me that family was more important than money. And foolishly, I believed I was doing the right thing, convinced I was being a good wife and daughter-in-law. I had mistaken manipulation for love and exploitation for gratitude. It was all an elaborate performance designed to keep me compliant and generous. Shane was not the loving, devoted man I had believed him to be. He was an accomplice, an actor in a play with the sole purpose of draining my bank account to the last cent. And I, supposedly a savvy businesswoman, had fallen for the oldest trap in the world, love. As I gazed at the sunset from my new balcony, I felt overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. The days passed slowly in my new place. I oscillated between periods of fierce resolve and paralyzing doubt. Had I done the right thing by running away? Should I have confronted Shane one last time? Was there even the slightest possibility that this was all a terrible misunderstanding? But then, like lightning, the memory of the baseball bat striking my back, and Shane's emotionless stare returned, erasing all doubts. No, there had been no misunderstanding. What I had experienced was real, and I had been the only one blind to it all this time. One afternoon, while going through the documents I had managed to take with me, I found our wedding photo. Shane and I were smiling at the camera, our faces glowing with happiness. Betty stood beside us, wearing what I now recognized as a calculating smile. I whispered to myself, wondering how I could have been so blind. I remembered how Daniel had looked at me, with worried eyes, asking if I was sure about marrying Shane. He had pointed out that I barely knew him and that he found his relationship with his mother strange. At the time, I laughed off his concerns, dismissing him as exaggerated, saying Shane was a wonderful person, Betty was charming, and they were just good friends. Now those words echoed in my mind with bitter irony. How many people had tried to warn me? And I had ignored them all, blinded by what I thought was love. As the days passed, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I reached out to trusted colleagues, vaguely explaining that I was dealing with personal issues and needed time. To my surprise and relief, most people showed understanding and offered their help. I began working remotely, on several projects, not out of financial necessity but to keep my mind occupied. Thanks to my foresight, and the accounts unknown to Shane and Betty, I had sufficient funds to last for a while. However, the real challenge wasn't financial, but emotional. Each day was a battle with memories, fighting the urge to call Shane for explanations, struggling against the impulse to return to the familiar life I knew was toxic. One sleepless night, I decided to write down everything I was feeling. I began my letter, "Dear Shane, though I wonder if you deserve that title anymore." I told him. I had so many things to say to him, so many questions that needed answers. I asked when he had stopped loving me, or if he had ever loved me at all. I wondered if it had all been an elaborate lie from the beginning. I wrote that I remembered the first day he introduced me to his mother, how proud and happy he seemed about his two most important women meeting. But now I wondered if they were already planning how to use me even then. I explained that the money wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt the most was realizing that the man I believed in, the man I fell in love with, had never actually existed. I reminded him that he had been there that night, watching as his mother attacked me. He had done nothing to help me. In that moment, I wrote, I understood that to him I was never a wife, never a partner, not even a human being. I was just a tool, a convenient bank for him and his mother. I admitted that part of me wanted to hate him, to scream and curse his name. Yet another part still loved him, or rather, loved the Shane I thought I had known. I asked how he could do those things to me, looking into my eyes every night, kissing me, telling me he loved me, all while knowing it was a lie. I asked how he could watch his mother physically and emotionally abuse me, without stepping in to help. I told him I needed to understand. But at the same time, I knew that no explanation could ever justify what they had done to me. That was why I had left, stepping away from him, and the life we had built together to make a new beginning. And despite the pain in my heart, despite my soul crying out against all these injustices, I was confident I had made the right decision. I wrote that I was no longer the Brittany he had known. That trusting woman who believed in fairy tales and unconditional love was gone. I told him that the new Brittany was stronger, wiser, and above all, determined never to be a victim again. I said goodbye to Shane, hoping that someday he would realize what he had lost and destroyed. When I finished writing, tears were rolling down my cheeks. But for the first time in weeks, these weren't tears of sadness or self-pity, they were tears of liberation. I saved the document, knowing I would never send it. This wasn't for Shane, it was for me, to close one story, to say goodbye to him, and to bid farewell to my past self who had forgiven too much. This wasn't a story of victims and villains, but a story of rebirth and rediscovery. And I, Brittany, would be the author of every page from now on. A week after I moved to the apartment, I received news that Betty had been arrested. The security camera footage had provided irrefutable evidence. When I saw her on the news in handcuffs, her face wearing a mask of indignation and shock, I felt an almost shameful satisfaction. Meanwhile, Shane had lost his job. The scandal had spread quickly through the business community, and his company, fearing bad publicity, had fired him without mercy. As the weeks passed, my case grew stronger. The financial evidence I had meticulously gathered over months clearly showed their extortion and economic abuse. Every transaction Betty had made, every debt, every luxurious expense drove another nail into the coffin of their defense. When the trial finally took place, it felt surreal. Sitting in the courtroom, looking across at Shane and Betty, I could hardly believe I had once considered these people family. Shane looked years older in just a few months, his face gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. Betty, on the other hand, maintained a facade of indignation, as if she were the real victim in all of this. Witness after witness, piece of evidence after piece of evidence, I watched as the intricate web of lies and manipulation they had woven around me unraveled. Our mutual friends expressed shock at discovering the true nature of our relationship. Financial experts detailed the extent of the economic abuse, and finally, the security camera footage showed everyone the brutal reality of what happened that night in my office. When my turn came to testify, I felt as if I were outside my body, watching a stranger tell my story. I described the years of sophisticated manipulation, how they had exploited my generosity, how they had used my love as a tool of control, and finally, I described that fateful night, the ultimate betrayal of Shane standing unmoved in the doorway as his mother attacked me. Throughout my testimony, I kept my eyes fixed on the judge, refusing to look at Shane or Betty, though I could feel their stares. Shane's eyes held a mix of shame and resentment, while Betty's barely contained her anger. Months after my escape, the final verdict was a complete victory. Betty was sentenced to 4 years in prison for physical assault and extortion. Though Shane avoided prison, he was found complicit in the economic abuse and ordered to pay substantial damages. As I left the courthouse, I felt oddly empty. It was a victory, yes, but at what cost? The past few years of my life felt like a dream I had finally woken from, though the reality was even more cruel. The following months became a period of rebuilding. Thanks to the money and additional damages, I had resources to start a new life. Slowly, I began rebuilding my company. It was a very slow process, often painful, with days of deep depression and questioning all my decisions. But with each new contract signed, each small success achieved, I felt myself slowly coming back. For years after that fateful night, I sat in my new company office, having built a network of tech companies that were revolutionizing the market and expanding my business. As I looked out at the bustling city view from my window, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, my secretary came in with today's newspaper. She pointed to a small article in the local section, suggesting I might want to see it. The article was about Shane and Betty. After Betty finished her prison term, they had moved to a small apartment in the suburbs. They were living on minimal social security, and Shane couldn't find work due to the scandal attached to his name. I read the article several times, expecting to feel something, satisfaction, or even pity. But all I felt was profound indifference. Shane and Betty no longer held any power over me, not even the power to evoke emotion. I handed the newspaper back to my secretary, and turned back to the window. The afternoon sun was bathing the city in golden light. For a moment, I felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over me. I had survived and triumphed, accomplished it all through my own strength. I picked up my phone and dialed a familiar number. When Sharon, now my friend as well as my lawyer, answered, I asked if she remembered our discussion about the foundation we had talked about, the one to support victims of domestic violence and economic abuse. I told her I thought it was time to make it happen. As Sharon expressed her enthusiasm, on the other end of the line, I felt a genuine smile form on my lips. Yes, I had lost much over the past few years. But I had also gained something like an invisible power. Not just to survive, but to thrive and use my experience to help others. Once more, I looked at the horizon, at my new city, my new home. A future full of possibilities, stretched out before me. The old Brittany, the naive and manipulable wife, had died that night. But from those ashes, a new Brittany had been born. Stronger, wiser, and above all, master of her own destiny. As the setting sun painted the sky in gold and rose, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The journey had been hard, but every step, every tear, every moment of doubt had been worth it. Because now, at last, I was truly free.